Now, Vietnam is not the only conflict that we see in this period. Under the terms of containment, you have to be very cautious fighting wars. We can't allow World War III to happen, all right, because in 1948, the Soviet Union has a nuclear weapon. Now the Americans and the Soviets both have nuclear weapons. In 1948, and 1949 rather, the Chinese Communist Revolution occurs, which causes a big tremor for America and the West, because now the two biggest countries in the world, the Soviet Union, Russia and the rest of the Soviet Union, and China are now communist. And then in 1950, the Chinese communists gathered together with the North Vietnamese and crossed the 38th parallel to invade South Korea to try to forcibly reunify Korea. So clearly, one of the reasons we get so involved in Vietnam is because of the situation in Korea. Vietnam is like a Korea Part 2. I mean, it's so similar. The Korean conflict is more successful for the American allies, however. This is not a war. It's a conflict. Under the terms of containment, you have to have United Nations police actions. You can't call them wars. They can't be only America charging in somewhere. There has to be a coalition, a UN coalition, or what President George W. Bush called a coalition of the willing. So that's why we see that desperation to make sure that this is not an America-only mission, because that would leave us open to being the aggressor and other nations might attack us and World War III would start. I mean, eventually, under the terms of NATO, we're responsible for the defense of 43 nations around the world. You can't defend 43 nations at once, especially when the Soviets have nuclear weapons. So this type of very closely targeted warfare, contained warfare, becomes the model. You can't have a World War III. It's impossible. We don't want that to happen. So it causes a real change in warfare and diplomacy around the world. Now, of course, in 1950, clearly the Chinese are entering onto the international stage, wanting to be an aggressive power. But, of course, they are eventually, by the United Nations coalition, pushed back across the 38th parallel, and North Vietnam and North Korea, North Korea and South Korea are still independent nations to this day. The Soviets were surprisingly very little involved in Korea or Vietnam. That was mostly the Chinese in Korea, and in Vietnam they gave a little bit of aid, but not very much. The Soviets, after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, grow much more cautious. With Nikita Khrushchev, in 1956, the Soviets begin to talk about peaceful coexistence, and they actually do try to thaw things up and to ease things up a little bit in the Soviet Union. But when the American U-2 spy plane is shot down in the Soviet Union, then the freeze is back on again. And so the Cold War never does really thaw. After that, of course, we see the construction of the Berlin Wall. And during that same period, of course, the Cuban Communist Revolution happens in 1959. They are frozen out by the Americans. They ally themselves with the Soviets. And immediately after that, this is during Kennedy's administration in 1960, the CIA starts to undertake a series of covert operations to try to kill Fidel Castro and to stop the revolution, even to the extent of some Cuban CIA exiles are trained by Eisenhower and then by Kennedy to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs fiasco and to try to overthrow Castro. And this, of course, is a fiasco. They're defeated. Kennedy cannot intervene because this might cause World War III. The Cubans demand that the Soviets build some missiles on Cuba to rebuff future American attacks, and this leads us to the closest that the Americans and the Soviets ever came to war, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Eventually, of course, the Soviets backed down and agreed to dismantle or to not build the missiles, and this provides a little bit of a thaw, but not very much. The 60s is really the high point of the Cold War, actually. We see the Vietnam conflict open up. We see the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1968. The Czechs decide that they are not too happy under Soviet rule, so they start to try to protest. They're invaded by the Red Army in 1968. There's the Hungarian uprising in 1956. The Hungarians try to rise up against the Soviets, and it doesn't succeed either. That's put down as well. In the 1960s and 70s, President Richard Nixon, starts a policy of what's called détente with the Soviet Union. That's on 752. Reductions on trade, reducing arms, and so forth. But of course, the Soviets continue to spend on defense and start to spend themselves into a serious deficit. So their economy is declining all through the 60s and 70s. There is, however, during Ford's administration, 1974 to 77, a series of Helsinki Accords, and the Soviets agree for the first time to recognize human rights. Human rights becomes a very big thing in the 70s. President Jimmy Carter really stresses human rights. The United Nations puts together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that people have a right to life, to liberty, to property. They have a right to a good-paying job. They have a right to health care, to good health. They have a right to housing. This never does pass. And it leads a lot of conspiracy-minded people to claim that the United Nations is actually some kind of communist conspiracy to bring in place of one world government. Well, that's just silly. It's nothing like that at all. But nevertheless, these things never do pass. In 1979, of course, the Soviet Union has its Vietnam when it decides to invade Afghanistan, and it is slowly defeated by a group of radical Muslim fundamentalists called the Mujahideen. The United States actually does start to through the CIA, very secretly and covertly, although the Soviets find out about it, we start to fund and assist the Mujahideen, and we give them Stinger missiles to shoot down Red Army helicopters. The Red Army eventually withdraws from Afghanistan. However, that same Mujahideen later becomes the Taliban, and they start to become a center of international terrorism. And of course, Osama bin Laden is sheltered by Afghanistan and is probably still somewhere around there to this day if he's alive. He probably is, I guess. So this little Cold War adventure is going to come back to haunt America in the future. And of course, it is haunting us right now because we are fighting a war there. And a lot of people are very concerned that the Soviets were successful there, and perhaps we might not be either. I don't know how the future is going to turn out. But it is quite ironic that this is one of our little proxy wars during the Cold War, and later it becomes our actual war. In Poland in 1979-1980, there's a series of protests against the Soviet domination of Poland that really does peak in the independent union called Solidarity. So there is serious decline in the Soviet sphere of influence. There's nations rising up against the Soviets. They have lost a serious war in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and most seriously of all, the Soviet economy is really in bad shape. So all through this period, we see a lot of instability in the world. We see a lot of instability, not only in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but also, as it says on page 756, in the former colonies of France and Great Britain and Belgium and other places in Europe. There are two distinct paths that many of these former colonies take. The first is general political instability and poverty. That has been the legacy of imperialism in Africa especially, also in Latin America, in places like Jamaica and Haiti and other places that were formerly colonies. They really have a hard time recovering because of the drastic nature of imperialism. Imperialism, of course, was a system that impoverished these people in the first place and kept them divided, kept them in turmoil, kept them in a disadvantageous position. And ironically enough, as we're going to see in Chapter 30, after the Cold War is over, during the Cold War itself, there are new international economic systems that in effect functionally replace imperialism and keep these people poor. So the political instability and the poverty have characterized former colonial states. But of course, Asia has had a more successful recovery from imperialism, especially China. But of course, ironically enough, the only way that China recovered was to go communist. So it really does complicate economies and views of these sort of things. But of course, in the 80s and 90s, communism does start to collapse because of its own, more than anything else, its own economic instability, and also because of its unwillingness to liberalize and allow true reforms. So in 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapses. China, by that time, had already taken on more of a capitalistic free market character that they have to this day. But Russia, of course, is also chronically poor. There's a lot more suffering and poverty and misery in Russia and Eastern Europe than we generally hear about on our media, and I've seen that myself up close. there is a lot of poverty and misery and anger and instability over there. So capitalism is not the success story in Eastern Europe that it's usually pointed out to be. We'll talk about these issues more in Chapter 30, and I want to make that a lecture on its own.